My husband forgot to end the call, and I accidentally overheard a heartbreaking conversation between him and his family, one that changed everything. The silence of the apartment felt heavy as Finn's voice drifted through the speaker. He sounded flat and cold. I gripped the countertop until my knuckles turned white. His mother's soft laughter cut through the static like a blade. They were talking about the wedding tomorrow as if it were a funeral. Then Finn admitted he felt trapped by the twins. I packed 2 duffel bags with shaking hands. The nursery smelled of lavender and clean laundry. My sons slept soundly in their cribs, oblivious to the storm. I moved with ghost-like precision, sliding diapers and formula into the side pockets. My reflection in the darkened window looked like a stranger. I left a short note on the kitchen island. It was simple and final. I didn't cry until I buckled the boys into their car seats. The engine hummed a low, lonely tune. The drive to my parents' house felt endless. Streetlights blurred into long streaks of amber. I reached the driveway at 2 in the morning, desperate for safety. My father met me on the porch, but his face was a mask of stone. He didn't offer a hug or a place to sleep. Instead, he held a phone in his hand. He told me Finn had called hours ago. He claimed I was having a breakdown. My father looked at me with deep, terrifying suspicion. Behind my father, the hallway light revealed my mother's pale face. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Then the gravel crunched under heavy tires. 2 vehicles pulled into the drive. One was Finn's black sedan, and the other carried the flashing lights of a cruiser. My heart dropped into my stomach. Finn stepped out with an expression of practiced concern. He looked perfect and tragic. A police officer walked toward my car with her hand on her belt. She looked ready for a fight. The officer demanded to see the children immediately. Finn stepped forward and handed over a thick stack of papers. They were emergency custody orders signed by a judge yesterday. My jaw went slack as I realized the trap was set weeks ago. My father started unbuckling Matteo from his seat. The boy woke up and began to wail for me. Finn watched with a calm, predatory stillness. My own parents were handing my sons over to a liar. I couldn't even move. Finn took the crying boys and loaded them into his car. He didn't look at me once. The officer told me to stay back or face arrest. My mother whispered that I needed professional help. They all believed his narrative because he had spent months building it. The red taillights faded as he drove away with my entire world. I stood alone in the cold driveway. I realized then that I had to become the monster he claimed I already was. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights hummed with a sick, yellow vibration. My hands felt like ice against the steering wheel. I sat in a back booth and stared at my phone. The screen showed a missed call from my mother. I ignored it and dialed Vera instead. She answered on the second ring with a groggy voice. I told her everything while watching the cook flip greasy burgers. Vera stayed silent as I described the custody papers. She finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. She confessed that Finn had called her last Tuesday. He had asked leading questions about my stress levels. I realized then that he was recording her. He wanted her to say I was failing as a mother. My stomach turned as I pictured him saving those files. He was building a digital cage around me. Vera promised to help me find a lawyer. A text message arrived from an unknown number. It was the name of a high-end attorney named Gideon Morris. Vera said he was expensive but absolutely brutal. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 in the morning. I called the number, and a man answered immediately. His voice was deep and alert like he never slept. He told me to stop talking to my parents. They were witnesses for the other side now. I spent the next hour writing down every detail. I listed every prenatal appointment that Finn had missed. My memory sharpened as the caffeine hit my system. He was rarely there for the anatomy scans or classes. I found old receipts for baby furniture I bought alone. Documentation was the only weapon I had left. Gideon told me to meet him at 8. I looked in the mirror and saw a ghost. My face was pale and gaunt. The sun began to rise over the parking lot. I walked into the law office feeling like a soldier. Gideon sat behind a desk made of dark oak. He scanned my notes with a sharp, clinical eye. He confirmed that Finn had filed for custody days ago. This was not a sudden reaction to my flight. It was a pre-calculated strike. Gideon looked at me and asked for my phone. He wanted the call logs immediately. We found proof that the wedding call stayed active. The 17 minutes of recorded silence would save me. Gideon smiled for the first time. It was a cold and terrifying expression. He explained that we would file an emergency motion. We needed to prove Finn obtained the order through fraud. I thought about my boys in that silent apartment. They were likely waking up and calling for me. Finn had no idea how to soothe them. The lawyer handed me a stack of fresh documents. He told me to go to a hotel. I could not return to our apartment yet. Finn had a restraining order against me there. My own home was now a restricted zone. I realized I was essentially homeless and childless. The power had shifted entirely into his hands. I walked toward the exit and saw a black sedan. It was parked across the street. Finn was watching me. I drove to a cheap motel near the airport. The neon sign buzzed with a rhythmic, dying click. Inside the room, the air smelled of stale smoke and lemons. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out my laptop. Gideon wanted a timeline of every missed appointment. I began to type while my chest ached for my sons. Every word felt like a small, sharp stone. The silence in the room was a heavy, physical weight. A notification pinged on my phone at noon. It was an email from Finn's high-priced attorney. He offered a settlement if I dropped the abuse claims. My stomach turned at the blatant manipulation. He was already trying to buy my silence before court. I forwarded the message to Gideon without a single word. The pressure was mounting in the small motel room. I realized then that Finn was genuinely terrified of the truth. He knew I had the call. Gideon called me 20 minutes later with a plan. We would subpoena the pediatrician's records for the boys. Finn had claimed they were neglected under my care. However, I knew the medical history told a different story. I had attended every checkup alone while he worked. Those records would prove his daily involvement was a lie. I felt a surge of cold, calculated energy. We were building a case that he could not escape. Then Gideon mentioned a new problem. Finn had moved my parents into our old apartment. They were acting as live-in nannies for the twins. My own mother was sleeping in my bed tonight. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound in my side. Finn was isolating the boys from any memory of me. He was creating a perfect, fake family for the judge. My parents were witnesses to his staged devotion. I gripped the motel remote until the plastic groaned. He was replacing me entirely. I walked to a nearby park to clear my head. The sight of a playground made my vision blur. I watched a young mother push a blue stroller. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. My phone buzzed with a video message from Finn. It showed the twins laughing in my parents' arms. They looked happy and healthy in the sunny living room. Finn was taunting me with their joy. He wanted me to break before Monday. I returned to the motel and checked the locks. My phone rang with a call from an unknown number. I answered and heard a woman's frantic whispering. It was Nina, a nurse from my doctor's office. She said Finn had visited her earlier that morning. He tried to trick her into altering my records. He wanted a note suggesting I had postpartum psychosis. Nina refused, but she sounded scared for her job. Finn was getting desperate and very dangerous. I called Gideon to report the witness tampering attempt. He sounded satisfied rather than worried by the news. This was the final piece of evidence we needed. We would trap Finn in his own web of lies. I tried to sleep, but my mind was racing. I stared at the ceiling and waited for dawn. Tomorrow would be the day I fought for my life. Then I saw a shadow move past my window. Someone was standing outside my room. I stayed frozen against the motel door as the shadow lingered. The silhouette was tall and unnervingly familiar. I reached for the heavy iron lamp on the nightstand. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back just an inch. It was Finn standing there in the cold rain. He looked ragged and pale under the flickering neon light. He wasn't moving toward the door. He was just watching the room with a hollow stare. I didn't open the door or call out to him. I sat on the floor with the lamp in my lap. My phone vibrated against the carpet with a text. "I know you are in there, Lacey." The message read. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. He was trying to provoke an emotional reaction for his records. If I opened the door, he would claim I attacked him. I ignored the screen and waited for the dawn. He left just before 5. Gideon met me at the courthouse steps at 9. The morning air was crisp and smelled of rain. He looked at my tired eyes and handed me coffee. "Keep your face neutral today," he warned quietly. We walked through the metal detectors into the marble hall. I saw Finn sitting on a wooden bench across the room. He wore his wedding suit and looked perfectly composed. My parents sat beside him like a loyal protective guard. They looked away. The courtroom felt small and smelled of old paper. Judge Northfield entered, and the room went dead silent. Finn's lawyer began by describing my midnight flight. He called it an act of erratic parental kidnapping. He spoke about my supposed history of emotional instability. I kept my back straight and stared at the wood grain. Gideon didn't interrupt or object to the lies. He just took notes with a silver pen. The pressure in my chest was almost unbearable. Then it was our turn to present the evidence. Gideon stood up and played the 17-minute recording. The speakers crackled with Finn's flat, cold voice. He spoke clearly about the children being a financial trap. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the clock. I watched my mother's face turn a sickly shade of gray. She looked at Finn like she was seeing a ghost. The power in the room shifted in an instant. Finn's lawyer looked down. Gideon followed the audio with the pediatrician's detailed records. He highlighted every appointment where Finn was completely absent. The judge flipped through the pages with a heavy frown. He looked at the medical documentation of my stability. Finn started to sweat under his expensive silk collar. He tried to lean over and whisper to his lawyer. The judge told him to sit back and remain silent. I finally felt the tide turning in my favor. Justice felt close. Judge Northfield removed his glasses and looked at us. He said the evidence of perjury was quite substantial. He ordered the immediate return of the children to me. I let out a breath I had held for days. Then the judge turned to Finn with a sharp look. He said a full custody trial would begin in December. Until then, Finn was granted supervised visits only. I stood up to leave, but Finn smiled. He pulled a new envelope from his jacket. The envelope crackled as Finn slid it across the table. Judge Northfield paused, his hand hovering over the gavel. I felt the victory drain from the room like water. Finn's lawyer explained that these were financial statements from a trust. They allegedly showed I had hidden assets during our 3 years together. My pulse thundered in my ears as Gideon leaned in close. He whispered that this was a classic diversion tactic to delay the transfer. Finn looked triumphant again. We spent 2 hours arguing over the bank records. Every minute felt like a sharp needle in my skin. The judge eventually grew tired of the bickering and shouting. He ruled that the boys would return to me today. However, he froze our joint accounts until the December hearing. I would have my children back, but no way to pay. Finn smirked as we walked out into the humid, gray afternoon. He had won the battle of the wallet. Gideon drove me to the apartment to collect my sons. The neighborhood looked surreal and far too quiet for midday. I stepped inside and found the living room completely stripped. Finn had taken the furniture, the rugs, and even the lamps. My parents stood by the door with their heads bowed low. They looked like strangers in the middle of a war zone. I didn't say a word as I walked past them. I headed straight for the nursery. Mateo and Silas were sitting on the bare hardwood floor. They looked confused and small in the empty, hollow room. I gathered them into my arms and smelled their hair. They clung to my neck as if I were a ghost. I felt a surge of pure, white, hot maternal fury. I carried them past my silent parents without looking back once. We left the empty apartment and never looked toward the windows. I was starting over with nothing. We moved into a small rental near the city park. The walls were thin and the floorboards groaned at night. I spent the next few weeks working 2 side jobs. Every dollar went toward legal fees and groceries for the boys. Finn showed up for his supervised visits every Saturday morning. He acted like a doting father while a social worker watched. I kept my face mask, like in my heart locked tight. The December trial loomed. Then a heavy box arrived on my doorstep in November. It was filled with old journals and a small recorder. There was a note from Finn's younger sister, Clara, inside. She said she couldn't stay silent about his true nature anymore. She had recordings of Finn planning the custody trap months ago. He had discussed the psychosis narrative with her over summer drinks. My hands shook as I realized Clara was my secret ally. The balance had shifted. I called Gideon and played the new recordings for him. He laughed, a short and sharp sound like a bark. This was the final nail in Finn's expensive, polished coffin. We were going to destroy his credibility once and for all. I looked at my sleeping sons and felt a cold peace. The trial was only 2 weeks away and I was ready. Then my phone buzzed with a text from Finn. "I am coming over now," it said. He sounded frantic. I locked the deadbolt and pushed the heavy kitchen table against the door. Finn pounded on the wood with a frantic, uneven rhythm. His voice was raw and cracked through the thin hallway. I stood in the center of the room with the iron lamp in my hand. The twins were huddled together on the small sofa behind me. I could hear Finn begging me to listen about his sister. He knew Clara had sent the box. He sounded like a dying animal in the dark. The pounding stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I peered through the small peephole into the dimly lit corridor. Finn was sitting on the floor with his head in his hands. He looked broken and small in the narrow space. I realized then that his polished mask was completely gone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, white envelope. He slid it under the door with a trembling hand. I stared at the paper as it moved across the floorboards. I pulled the envelope from the rug with a wary touch. It contained a single key to a local storage unit. A handwritten note explained that everything he stole was inside. He had hidden the furniture and the rugs to protect them. He claimed his lawyer had forced the aggressive financial move. I didn't believe him for a second. The subtext of his apology felt like a desperate plea for mercy. He knew the December trial would end his career. He was terrified of me. I opened the door just 3 inches to face him. The chain was still engaged as I looked at him. Finn looked up with red, hollow eyes. He apologized for the trap he had built so carefully. He said the fear of losing his money changed him. I told him that fear was no excuse for betrayal. He looked at the twins and started to weep softly. I felt a cold, sharp distance in my chest. I shut the door and turned the heavy lock. The next morning I drove to the storage unit alone. The facility was cold and smelled of damp concrete. I found the unit and swung the heavy door open. Everything from our old life was stacked in the dark. I saw the cribs and the velvet rugs from our bedroom. I felt a strange sense of mourning for the past. I realized that Finn was trying to buy his way out. He wanted to settle before Clara took the stand. I called Gideon immediately. Gideon met me at the unit within 20 minutes. He scanned the inventory with a hard, clinical gaze. He said this was an admission of guilt in disguise. We could use the return of the goods as leverage. I touched the wood of the cribs and felt sick. Finn had lived in a lie for 3 years. He was only sorry because he was finally caught. Gideon told me to keep the storage key very safe. It was physical proof of his deceptive, erratic behavior. The December trial arrived with a sudden, bitter frost. The courtroom was packed with lawyers and silent observers. Finn sat at his table looking gray and very thin. Clara sat on the front bench behind me. She wouldn't look at her brother even once. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Judge Northfield entered and the silence became a heavy weight. I felt the power in the room settle on me. I was no longer the victim. Gideon played Clara's secret recordings for the stunned court. Finn's voice filled the room with cold, strategic malice. He detailed the plan to fake my postpartum psychosis. I watched the judge's face turn into a hard mask. Finn's lawyer looked at his shoes in utter silence. The narrative of the unstable mother died in that moment. My parents sat in the back looking completely ashamed. They had believed a monster instead of their own daughter. I felt finally heard. Finn took the stand in a last, desperate attempt. He spoke about his love for the boys through tears. He said the money was just a way to survive. I watched him and felt absolutely nothing but cold pity. The judge asked him about the storage unit and the lies. Finn couldn't find the words to defend his actions. He was a hollow man in an expensive suit. He looked at me and mouthed a final apology. I turned my head toward the judge. The ruling was swift and left no room for hope. Finn was stripped of his unsupervised visitation rights indefinitely. He was ordered to pay back every cent he stole. I walked out of the court with the boys. The winter sun felt warm on my face for once. Finn stood on the steps looking lost and alone. I realized then that I had finally won my life. The trap was gone and we were finally free. I didn't look back. 6 months of silence followed the trial like a heavy shroud. I established a rhythmic life in the new rental home. The boys were thriving and their laughter filled the small rooms. I worked long hours to build a separate financial future. Gideon called me on a Tuesday morning with a sharp warning. Finn had filed a new motion to relocate to Portland. He claimed a job offer required him to move immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs with a fresh, cold fear. The legal papers arrived at my door within 2 hours. Finn wanted to take the twins 3 states away now. He proposed a visitation schedule that would effectively erase me. I sat at my kitchen table and read his demands. The subtext was clear. He wanted to reboot his entire life. He couldn't stand the sight of my new, quiet independence. I called Asher and told him about the sudden legal move. He arrived with coffee and a look of deep concern. Finn's justification for the move was a high-paying executive role. He claimed it was the only way to pay debts. Gideon met us at the courthouse to file an opposition. We walked through the marble halls with a heavy resolve. The air in the building felt stagnant and smelled of dust. I saw Finn standing near the elevators with his lawyer. He looked rested and confident in a charcoal-tailored suit. He didn't look like a man who was struggling financially. We entered the small hearing room for the relocation motion. Judge Northfield looked older and more tired than last winter. Finn's attorney argued that the move was purely a career decision. He spoke about professional growth and the need for fresh starts. I watched Finn's face for any sign of his old malice. He looked neutral and polished like a corporate training video. Gideon leaned in and whispered that we needed a new strategy. We had to prove the move was retaliatory. Gideon stood up and presented a series of printed photos. They were from my social media showing me with Asher. We proved Finn only applied for jobs after seeing them. The timing of his applications was suspicious and very precise. Finn shifted in his seat as the judge reviewed the dates. The room went silent as the connection became undeniably clear. Finn wasn't moving for a job, he was fleeing my joy. He wanted to win by taking them away. The judge asked Finn if he had consulted me first. Finn admitted he had only informed me after the offer. He claimed he had a right to seek better opportunities. Judge Northfield took off his glasses and looked at him. He said that parenting required more than just sending emails. The tension in the room reached a breaking high point. I felt the tide turning toward my favor once again. Then Finn's lawyer pulled out a thick, blue folder. The blue folder contained evidence of my own recent travels. They had hired a private investigator to follow my life. The photos showed me and Asher looking at houses together. Finn's lawyer claimed I was planning my own secret relocation. My stomach turned as I realized I was being watched. I had never mentioned the house hunting to anyone but Asher. The power balance in the room shifted back to the center. I felt exposed and vulnerable under the bright lights. Judge Northfield looked at the photos with a heavy scowl. He asked me directly if I intended to move away. I told him the truth about staying in the city. We were looking for more space for the growing boys. Gideon stood and argued that local moves were not relocations. He pointed out the difference between neighborhoods and distant states. The judge nodded slowly, but he still looked quite skeptical. I gripped the wooden chair until my fingers felt numb. The judge called a recess and told us to talk. Finn met me in the hallway with a strange look. He said he didn't want to go to Portland. He just wanted to know he still mattered to them. I realized the move was a desperate cry for relevance. He felt like a ghost in the boys' new lives. I told him he was their father, not a stranger. He looked at me and finally lowered his guarded gaze. We were both just very tired. We walked back into the room with a signed agreement. Finn would stay and accept a local, stable position. In exchange, I agreed to an expanded, shared parenting schedule. We would follow a 1-week on and 1-week off model. It was the hardest decision I ever had to make. My boys would be gone for 7 days at a time. But they would have a father who stayed for them. I signed the paper and felt a new burden. The first week of the shared schedule felt like a slow amputation. I sat in the silent kitchen and watched the clock crawl toward 7. The boys were with Finn in his new, modest apartment across town. I had to trust the man who once viewed them as a trap. Every vibration of my phone sent a jolt of static through my nerves. I waited for a crisis that never came. My sons were learning to live in two different worlds. Co-parenting counseling began on a rainy Tuesday in late October. We sat in a small office that smelled of peppermint and old books. Dr. Chen looked at us over the rims of her narrow glasses. She asked us to define our common goals for the children. Finn spoke about stability while I focused on the truth of the past. The air was thick with the residue of 1,000 lies. We had to build a bridge over a canyon. A strange breakthrough happened during our 4th session in the clinic. Finn admitted that he had been terrified of being a father like his own. He looked at his hands and spoke about a cycle of resentment. I saw a flicker of the man I had first loved years ago. The power shifted as I realized he was finally being honest with himself. He wasn't just a villain. He was a legacy of cold, broken men. The realization didn't fix the past. We started a shared digital calendar to manage the twins' busy lives. I saw Finn's entries for soccer practice and weekend trips to the zoo. He was showing up in ways he never had during the pregnancy. We spoke on the phone without the sharp, jagged edges of our old anger. It was a professional arrangement built on the ruins of a failed marriage. The boys began to thrive under the new, balanced routine of our days. Asher and I moved into a sun-drenched house near the old park. We invited Finn over for a civil dinner to discuss the holidays. He stood in my new hallway and looked at the framed family photos. There was no malice in his eyes as he shook Asher's hand firmly. We were finally becoming the adults our children needed us to be. The transition was quiet and surprisingly peaceful for everyone involved. I felt the old lie finally dying. Christmas morning arrived with a soft blanket of white, fresh snow. Finn brought the boys over at 10 as we had carefully planned. We sat together by the fireplace and watched them tear into bright packages. I realized that a family isn't just about blood or a wedding ring. It is about the choice to stay and do the work every day. Then I saw a small, silver box hidden behind the tree. It was addressed to me from Finn.